At the beginning of this book, there is a movie you describe that seems almost as unbelievable as it was for you to watch, as it is for a reader to read about. Your description of it, it's a movie called The Next Voice You Hear. It's about God speaking through the radio to the American public. What is this film?
I think that the Next Voice You Hear is in a way the quintessential early Cold War movie. It has a number of themes, the idea of dramatic intervention into history, transmissions from outer space. It conveys a huge amount of anxiety, and yet is meant to calm the audience. And it's really sort of an unprecedented movie, I think, this kind of direct address to bring God right into history to talk to the American people.
From KCSB in Santa Barbara and Colin Marshall Radio, I'm Colin Marshall. This is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'll tell you now, listening audience, there are only really two critics whose criticism I find I can fully put my trust in to lead me to interesting film. One we've heard on the show a few months back, Jonathan Rosenbaum. The other is talking to me today, Jay Hoberman, who's the senior film critic at The Village Voice. He's been writing for them for many years, since 1977, and he's, in addition to being a critic, a film historian, and another volume, the second released volume of a trilogy of books on American film during the Cold War has been released this summer. It's An Army of Phantoms, American Movies in the Making of the Cold War, which, as we've discussed, begins with that film, The Next Voice You Hear. And, you know, you use this word anxiety, and it's a word I wanted to bring up because reading the book, it seems to me that there's so many separate factors creating, so many historical factors creating anxiety, sort of injecting anxiety into Hollywood films. Is that at all an accurate way to sort of broadly put it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have, first of all, a widespread cultural and political anxiety, which is a direct outgrowth of World War II, with the reality of the atomic bomb and what was perceived as a death struggle with an alien system. But there was a more specific anxiety within Hollywood because the industry had been profoundly shaken by a number of events which occurred in the aftermath of the war. The studios lost the theaters. They lost their distribution wing, and then there was the threat of television, which was only dimly understood, I think, at this point by the movie industry. But certainly they knew that this was going to change the entire entertainment equation in the United States.
And this is what's so fascinating, especially as you well know about the way that The Next Voice You Hear exemplifies it. There's the meeting of political anxiety and technological anxiety, and there's so many forms of this. Like any form history can pile on, it does. And I want to ask you this: working on this volume of the trilogy that deals with the early Cold War and American cinema, what questions did you have about the way this anxiety operated on Hollywood, or the way Hollywood reacted to it? I mean, what were the driving questions for you about this dynamic?
Well, I start by asking myself always, what brought this film object into existence? What forces determined that? And that's one reason, certainly, why I love The Next Voice You Hear so much, because it's a kind of a symptom as much as a movie. Other movies come into existence. I mean, it's very simple. This star was successful in an earlier movie, and the studio wants to build on that, or the genre has been popular, and so on. But there are other movies most obviously the anti-communist noirs, which came into existence for political reasons. And something that I became aware of while I was researching this book that I hadn't really thought about quite this way was how integral Hollywood and the movie industry was to the war effort during World War II. And I think that during the war, Hollywood was closer than it had ever been before, certainly, and than it ever would be again to the government. It was really producing a kind of official art or entertainment. It functioned as a cheerleader, a morale booster, and individual film artists and people who worked in the movie industry contributed on their own to the war effort too. So I found this quite striking, and I think that when I refer to the Hollywood in the making of the Cold War, this was to emphasize that Hollywood didn't see the end of its mission, let's say, when the war ended. It's just that different people defined the mission in different ways.
There's a line you said in another interview about this book that really struck me was, and I know I won't quote this verbatim, but the idea behind it being that Hollywood was so active during the war, and they kind of, I'll refer to Hollywood as, quote unquote they, but they had a sense of still being mobilized, like a lingering sense of mobilization for the American cause. Is that a way to put it?
Yes, I think so. I think that there's a tendency among the public and commentators and even film historians to see that Hollywood saw itself as primarily a vehicle for entertainment and then a business to make money, and this is emphasized by these famous, possibly apocryphal statements like, if I want to send a message, I'll use Western Union or something. The idea that movies weren't supposed to mean anything, let alone have some kind of social significance or contribute in some sort of positive way to society. And actually, I think that during the war, and largely because of the war, Hollywood had a tremendous sense of its own importance, its own significance, and they felt that they were doing more than just entertaining people. They were educating them, they were inspiring the American people, and so on. One of the ironies of history is that the most gung-ho, politically active people in Hollywood during World War II were by and large left-wing New Dealers, communists, and fellow travelers.
No matter what perspective the individual movies you discuss in An Army of Phantoms are coming from, no matter what cause they support, depending on, what definition of propaganda do you use, number one, but also, is every movie you talk about in this book propaganda of some kind?
Well, let me start with that first. No, I think that some movies are more propagandist than others. Certainly a movie like the Great Lift, the movie about the Berlin Airlift, is a movie which sets out to celebrate a political victory, / military victory that the United States won during the Cold War by successfully rescuing the encircled city of West Berlin from being overrun by the Red Army, and that's the movie is made to establish that, and primarily, and then secondarily, I think the movie had an agenda where it wanted to show that the Germans were now our friends. After many years of movies in which the Germanys were our worst enemies. So you could say that that's propagandist. A movie like I Married a Communist, you hardly have to know anything more about it other than the title to see, that it's a kind of horror film and propagandists. But a lot of the movies are movies that engage issues, engage with certain ideas, either from the right or from the left, and it's difficult to pigeonhole them as propaganda. That said, the definition of propaganda that I'm the most comfortable with, or the theory of propaganda, is the one that was developed by the French philosopher Jacques Ellul in the late 50s, early 60s, where he sees propaganda as something. It's almost like it's almost like a fact of nature. It's something which societies put out intentionally or unintentionally, and in fact, unintentional propaganda, what he calls sociological propaganda, is much more potent because it's sort of without necessarily meaning to establishing that this is the way things are. This is the way things are, and encouraging people to regard the world in a certain way and form certain judgments and so on. And it's not meant to particularly to incite action so much as to promote acceptance.
With the perspective we have, at least in this point in history, with the perspective you can get with your research from this point in history, how effective, or what is the range of effectiveness do you think these films had in terms of actually instilling a certain worldview, in terms of inculcating ideas about this is how things are? I mean, certainly some were more effective than others, but how effective could they be?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and a tricky one. I mean, there is a sense in which politicians and let's say producers of entertainment have certain things in common, and that is they each want to come up with a kind of scenario that appeals to the largest number of people by nature of what they do. In the case of politicians, you can see how successful they are by whether they're elected to office, returned to office, and so on. How their ideas are spread. With movies, it's trickier because you can talk about the movies that were the biggest box office hits. But often those were movies that were at least overtly apolitical or even anti-political. And so you have to sort of see how movies operate in a larger context. I mean, just for an example, Samson and Delilah, the Cecil B. DeMille biblical spectacular that was I think the biggest hit of 1949. I see that movie as being part of several things. On the one hand, it's a very kind of anachronistic movie. It harks back to the spectacles of the silent era. Although there were there were some biblical spectacles in the 30s, but this was like a super spectacle and so on. So it's kind of showing that movies can still do what they used to do. It's a kind of a delicious coincidence that the movie that's being made within the movie Sunset Boulevard, a movie about the decline of Hollywood, is Samson and Delilah. But it's not just about Hollywood's sort of going back to its true religion, but it's part of a general religious revival that happens in American culture in the aftermath of World War II, where there comes to be a sense that we're fighting the communists. The communists are godless. We're then godful. I mean, there's a new sense of a kind of militant religion in the United States that it's not as if this never existed before, but it certainly has a new meaning. Also, that we're living in a kind of apocalyptic moment, and I think that's the reason why these biblical spectaculars would appeal. So my point is that there's a lot of ways in which a movie like Samson and Delilah could appeal to a large audience and also could sort of shape their view about, or contribute to shaping their view about reality, apart from just retelling this colorful, kind of sexy story from the Bible.
There does seem to be in so many of these films that sense of trying to establish what American is, especially in terms of what American is versus what communism is, and establishing that American equals not communism in a certain sense. But I want to know, in these films, how, and I guess I could put this quite simply and say, watching these movies, if you didn't know anything about communism, could you infer any real, true facts about communism from them? Are these films, how much is it a made-up version of communism, or sort of a communism of the mind that they use, and how much of it is actually based at all and rooted at all in the realities of communism being something that it's against? Does that make any sense?
Oh, that's a terrific question, actually. I mean, one of the things that's so striking to me about the next voice you hear, for example, is that the two great sources of anxiety, or even the three great sources of anxiety, the bomb, communism, and television, are not mentioned in this movie. So you sort of have to deduce from it that people are upset. I mean, they must be upset about something. I mean, if it seems a good idea to have this divine intervention into history, to especially to tell people that everything they do is basically okay. So sure, there are movies that where there are what literary critics would call structuring absences. I mean, the most significant thing is just not in the movie, and you sort of have to see how the other forces or array themselves around this vacuum. So there are westerns which are always a great example, because they deal with a very small period of American history, but they're really always talking about all of American history. So there are westerns that are in effect movies about the Korean War, and the frustrations of the war, and the idea that it's a really kind of dirty war fought not only against an ideological enemy, but a racial enemy as well, in a godforsaken part of the planet, and so on. And then there were movies like I Married a Communist, or a better example would be The Red Menace, or I Was a Communist for the FBI, which try and make some didactic points about what communism is, and why we should be afraid of it, and so on.
Now, when I was first getting into films, when I was basically a little kid, almost just coming out of that, just coming into cinephilia, I remember judging the American films of this early Cold War period as being very much shaped by paranoia or anxiety or fear, very much shaped by government strongmen who demand that anti-communist messages be inserted into movies, and thus made sort of stiff and dorky and didactic in that way. And that's a far, far, far too simple way of looking at things. But I notice people, especially those who are casual film viewers, do hold that view of this sort of the rigidity of the films of this time, and the idea that they were almost state dictated. What's the most important thing to complicate that sort of that snap judgment that some people have about movies of this time,
particularly as the Cold War developed, and once the what we could call the ideological battle was resolved in Hollywood, movies became more complicated. The next voice you hear is, for me, the quintessential early Cold War movie. Invasion of the Body Snatchers is the quintessential Cold War movie because it's a very direct allegory, very immediate allegory. The idea of people having their minds colonized by aliens from outer space and so on. and kind of a novel one for the time. I mean, we're very familiar with it now. Actually, audiences were taken aback by this. But there are a number of ways to look at it. You can't read it simply as an anti-communist film. It also has elements of seems to be an attack on suburban conformism, which was a big theme at the time. So for me, that it works in both of these ways is a tribute to the movie's complexity, and the fact that it's so immediately graspable is kind of a proof of its popular its greatness as popular art. And there are other examples. I mean, High Noon is not a movie that I like as much, but I recognize it as a tremendously effective piece of filmmaking. And the guy who was most responsible for it, Carl Foreman, thought that it was an attack on Hollywood cowardice. But it's a movie that went on to be the most popular movie ever among American presidents, because they can identify with the idea of this Marshall, Gary Cooper, standing up for what he believes when everybody else is running for cover and so on. And a number of Europeans saw it as a kind of allegory about America's role in the world. So that, I think, adds to the richness of it. And then there were movies like John Ford's The Searchers, which is just, and what to my mind the richest Western ever made, and one of the great American movies, because it deals with not just the settling of the West, but with racial attitudes and racial fears in a very blunt way. And of course, came out in 1956, which is the same year as the Montgomery bus boycott and so on, made segregation a defining issue in American culture. Or Kiss Me Deadly, which is a movie that's part noir, part science fiction, takes the worst, sleaziest private eye in American literature, Mike Hammer, and uses him as the protagonist, but as a kind of negative protagonist, and ends up being about the atomic bomb. I mean, this is a very complicated movie, I think. And so, I feel that the 50s is actually a pretty good a period. And parenthetically, I would say that some of the movies that seem quite propagandist are effective as movies as well.
Just tuning in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall. My guest this week is Jay Hoberman, senior film critic at The Village Voice. He's been there since 1977. He's also a film historian. His new book is a work of film history, one part of his 3-part Cold War series. It's called An Army of Phantoms, American Movies and the Making of the Cold War. When the conversation's over, be sure to catch it as a podcast on colinmarshallradio.com or on iTunes. Open up the iTunes store and search for the Marketplace of Ideas there, or colinmarshallradio.com. You'll get access to the complete Marketplace of Ideas interview archive, of course, completely free. And for weekly updates on all things Marketplace of Ideas, do sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Details are available at where else but colinmarshallradio.com. Very simple, very easy, of course, very free. Now back to the conversation with Jay Hoberman on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. It is made obvious in your book. You read about the films in depth, and even if you haven't seen them in a while, if someone hasn't seen Body Snatchers in a while, or one of these movies you mentioned in a while, they can see how much better they are than they seem in certain respects. And it is fascinating to me to read you particularly write about these movies, because coming to your work through your criticism, reading your articles, they became the articles that I would go to learn about directors like an Abbas Kiarostami or a Chantal Akerman or a Claire Denis, or the names like those are usually not American names. And from what I would, my first assumption would be that the aesthetic of those films is so different from the aesthetic of these Cold War American films. How does it fit into your and I don't quite know how to put it, but how do these films fit into your sort of personal aesthetic map of cinema? What you gravitate toward aesthetically? Where do these fit in?
Okay, I mean let me see if I can answer that. I mean, let me start by saying that there have always been certain American action directors who I just love as filmmakers. I mean, Don Siegel would be one, Samuel Fuller, Nicholas Ray to a degree, Howard Hawks to a degree, and so on. So I always thought these guys were great filmmakers, and there's a sense in which I think that Chantal Akerman and Sam Fuller have some things in common, just in the way that they use film language or put it together, sort of think through cinema. And when you're reviewing films on a weekly basis, which is what I do, it's my day job, a good one.
Yes.
I'm not complaining, but in a way, you sort of you're taking what comes. And I was always looking for the stuff that was the most exciting to me as film, and I think I had fairly eclectic tastes, and so that made it all the better. What I'm doing in the books that I wrote that are more historical is kind of looking at an aspect of the culture that movies generated. So even though there are individual filmmakers like Fuller or Siegel, to whom I'm very partial, I'm not really writing a book about their filmmaking per se, as about a kind of the whole collective enterprise that goes on into making a larger culture and their role in that.
I want to establish as well for a listener who might not have read your other book in this trilogy, what will become a trilogy, the other book, The Dream Life, on the 60s. Now, how do these two books that are now published in the trilogy link together? I mean, there's obviously The Dream Life picks up where Army of Phantoms leaves off, but how much of a piece do you see them? Do you really see The Dream Life as the straight continuation of Army of Phantoms, or does more change than that?
Well, yes. I mean, although it certainly has been. I like the idea of doing the middle book first, and then going back in time, and then jumping ahead for the last book. It's an interesting way to work because I tend to find my ideas as I'm working with the material. I didn't really have any preset notions. I mean, I had preferences, interests, prejudices, whatever, things I wanted to write about. But I discovered things in writing about them, and more specifically in making certain kinds of juxtapositions. It's just the way that I think. I mean, I like to, if I bring things together, I'll get an idea. It's not unlike editing. I mean, montage. It's the basis of film language. So originally, I was just going to write one book from 1945 to 1989 or something, and that turned out to be crazy. And then I realized I would have to cut it down, and in fact, the publisher told me that I had to cut it down. So I just chose the middle part on the 60s because that I really was anxious to write about it. I mean, I had been a young person then, and it just was the stuff was so vivid to me. I mean, and still, and I was really eager to work with the material, and I sort of liked the idea of just beginning the story in the middle. But I would not have written the Dream Life the same way. I'm sorry, I would not have written an Army of Phantoms the same way if I hadn't done the Dream Life first, and I know for certain that the final book will come out of having done both of these in this particular way.
Now, I want to know more about coming of age as a cinephile in this toward the end of the Army of Phantoms period and throughout the Dream Life period. And when I had Jonathan Rosenbaum on this program, I lamented to him, a lot of us are pretty sad or regret that we were born too late to experience the 1960s as the films came out, and to watch those films as they emerged and excited, the film world at the time. What memories from that time would drive you to come back in doing a work of history and re-examine it from multiple angles, to write actual books about it? What about living through that time in cinema made you want to spend so much time now looking back at it?
It's funny because I don't really write about the movies that inspired my cinephilia, right, particularly. Although, there certainly are some movies that made a tremendous impression on me. I'm a few years younger than Jonathan, so I was not as fully formed in the 60s. I was for example, when Dr. Strangelove came out, I was not quite 15. I was still 14 when that movie came out, and I liked movies. I went to movies. That was the first movie that I went to see a second time. The movie just spoke to me in such a direct way, and the reason for that was that movie addressed a concern of mine. As a kid coming, through the Cuban Missile Crisis and so on, having some inchoate political sense, and I loved it, and I didn't really think about it as cinema. And as I got interested in movies, as movies, which was around that time or soon after, I would go to movies at the Museum of Modern Art or the various revival theaters, and I was always looking at things on television, so that my sense of film history was not so much that it was happening then, as sort of discovering it all at once. A way of thinking of that was when I was a child. They would put old cartoons on TV for kids, cartoons from the 30s, even from the 20s. So I remember as a kid seeing these Betty Boop cartoons and thinking, these are great, but I had no sense that this was like an old that these cartoons were already 25 years old.
Right, and kids today don't have the sense that they're 50, 60 years old. It's new for every generation of kids.
So that's the way it was for me with cinephilia. I would go and I would see Breathless or Shoot the Piano Player, and this was a couple of years after the movies came out. They weren't brand new, so they were revivals. But I would also be seeing revivals of W.C. Fields, or going to the Museum of Modern Art and seeing, Eisenstein and Griffith and so on. And so it all was of a piece. I was enthusiastic about it all. Which is not to say that there weren't things that I, it's a privilege always to see something when it's new and there's no or not much conventional wisdom around it. So, I can remember, one example, seeing Pure Le Fou or Two or Three Things I Know About Her. I'd seen them for the first time were just stunning experiences for me. And for other people, I was interested that, Chantal Ackerman saw Pure Le Fou probably around the same time. We're about the same age, and decided to become a filmmaker after seeing it. So that's something that has to do with being in a specific time, in a certain place. But something about the 60s that's fascinating is that it was such a great period for filmmaking. And I'm still coming across things that I had no idea existed at the time, and seeing them now.
And would I be wrong to say that this might have stoked a cinephilia in you, and you certainly do write a lot about the aesthetic element of the films that you write about, but I want to know how far you can trace back the interest you clearly have in the, shall I call it, the inextricability of films and the societies that produce them, films and the social world, because not every critic is into that.
Well, I did read From Caligari to Hitler in either in high school or maybe when I was just starting college. I mean, one of the things was that in the 60s certainly was that which may have been a good thing, was that there seemed to be a paucity of writing about film, books about movies. So, I would go to the library and read whatever I could find. And so I managed to read a lot of different books, and I don't know that I would have picked up From Caligari to Hitler if there had been even more books, to read. But I read that, and I think that I was impressed with that. And I remember actually talking about it or having a conversation when I was a freshman in college with another guy. We were talking about King Kong. He said, well, King Kong is a movie about racism. Let's think about it. Look at this. What is this? I mean, what else could it be? And I said, oh my God, that's so true. And then I thought, we could possible to do a book, Caligari to Hitler. How about From Strange Love to like Wallace or Reagan or worse or something like that? So I guess that's when I began thinking about it. I mean, I was a political kid, certainly during the Vietnam War, but even before that. I mean, my parents, had politics, and I grew up in a certain milieu in New York, so I had a political interest. But I think that it was later that these things came together. And I should also say that, this was something that was happening among filmmakers. I mean, a movie like, Dusan Makaveyev's W.R. is, I mean, it's a fantastic fusion of aesthetic, cultural, political thinking. I mean, it's all in there.
And, you mentioned W.R., and maybe this might have been something unique to the time, but that movie is engaging if you are tapping in, if you're really sort of trying to sense the politics working behind it, but it's also very engaging if you're not doing that at all. Like, it's on every level, and I don't know if films do that as well anymore. Have the politics working, but also have so much to engage with that the politics don't necessarily matter to a viewer who doesn't understand it or know about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's just a very exciting movie in many ways. I mean, bringing all these things together, and also he's reporting. I mean, he had this guy from Yugoslavia coming to being able to make a movie in New York in the 60s, a kind of independent, almost underground film, and he loves it. He's finding all this stuff, So I think that's it's hard. Even then, that would have been an unusual film. But I think you're right that movies have been displaced in a way, and it pains me to say that. But I think that certainly they take up a lot of cultural space. I mean, there's something that people have in common. People talk about them, and still, and are actually concerned with grosses and so on. But a lot of that is just, I don't know. It seems it feels hollow to me. I mean that they're just not as important to the way that people think about things. I mean, when the Social Network came out, that really engaged a lot of people, audiences, critics. I mean, it gave them something to grapple with. It really seemed to be about something that was happening now in an interesting way, and so on. But I think that some decades ago there were movies like that every week.
Now, what is this? If maybe this doesn't, but what might it have to do with the fact that this trilogy, An Army of Phantoms and The Dream Life, and the book that will follow, begins immediately after World War II, and it will end presumably at the fall of the Berlin Wall. What's your interest in researching and writing about a world, the world of American film or otherwise, but writing about a world and thinking about a world where communism exists?
Well, it was very important to me growing up. It had a lot to do with the way that I saw the world, and I think there's a line in The Jazz Singer, what a little boy learns, he never forgets, or something like that. So I think that my sense of the world. I mean, the Berlin Wall fell quite some time ago, and and life goes on, and the world has changed, and it's not as if I feel like I'm trapped in the past, but I am fascinated by the dynamics of that period, and it seemed to provide a kind of a historical framework that I could use. I mean, a lot of things. I for example, the Clinton period, the 90s. I was reviewing every week. I wrote quite a bit about the movies in that time, and made an anthology of those pieces, and so I don't really feel any great desire to revisit that period. Whereas the 50s, I was a child,
Yes.
but the 60s and later, I am interested in going back and thinking about it in a more critical, organized, adult fashion.
For those just tuning in, this is the Marketplace of Ideas, and I'm Colin Marshall, talking this week to Jay Hoberman, senior film critic at The Village Voice and author of An Army of Phantoms, American Movies and the Making of the Cold War. If you want to get weekly updates on current interviews, upcoming interviews, and more on the Marketplace of Ideas, sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Simple, easy details at colinmarshallradio.com, which is also the home of the official Marketplace of Ideas interview archive. Find them all downloadable as podcasts there, or on iTunes. You can search in the iTunes store for the Marketplace of Ideas. Now back to the conversation with Jay Hoberman on the Marketplace of Ideas, cultural conversation of the depth you demand. Now, I guess to some people in America, what would have been the specter of communism, I suppose, gave a lot of relevance to movies that explicitly or implicitly dealt with communism. That made these movies something they could engage with just strongly on some level. And I was thinking back to what you said a few minutes ago about perhaps movies have lost some of the cultural relevance they once had. And I wonder, and of course I know this trilogy is about specifically American film, but I wonder if perhaps the geographical center of cinema's relevance has simply moved elsewhere. I often get the sense that I came along too late for the heyday of American film, but that other places are having heydays of film. Is that true at all in your mind from what you see and experience?
Oh, yeah, and I think that to some degree it's quite mysterious why there will suddenly be an efflorescence of a film culture in a particular place. I mean, some places are eternal, right? I mean, I think that there'll be French film culture will exist as long as there's movies, but between 1945 and 1975, I would argue that film for film, the Italian film industry was the best in the world, but that ceased to be true. I mean, it's just there was a moment, and it was a long moment, and we don't have it anymore. And why there should be a sudden burst of film activity, in Iran and in Romania and in Israel now. I mean, I would say the Chinese cinema that's ongoing, although clearly it's a major film producer, is in some ways mysterious. I mean, you could come up with ideas for social trends, but it doesn't fully explain why that would happen in any of these places at this time. Mexico, another place.
But I wonder if just because American film, Americans can look back on American film during the Cold War time period and see so many exciting things happen, and we can look back and think, geez, why aren't films so exciting anymore as they seem to have been then? But couldn't we just say, well, we've got blinders on? If that's the case, we could just look around the world and see that film is as, or perhaps more exciting? I mean, is it on the viewer now? They could find all the film culture they want if they just sort of open themselves up?
Oh, yeah. I think that, I mean, this has been, yes, I think this is true. And in fact, people began bemoaning the death of cinema, decades ago. And one of the things that was very striking to me when I became a regular reviewer at the Voice was just this kind of lack of interest among film critics too in certain foreign films, films that were considered difficult and this, that, and the other thing. I mean, so I think that's true. That the a serious audience exists. I think that the popular audience has to some degree moved on. I mean, there are reasons why foreign films were had a much broader base in the 50s and 60s, and that what we could call the film journalists, film intelligentsia, became lazy in some respects. I want to go back to something you said before because about that communism or the fight against communism, the struggle with communism, gave American movies a certain kind of relevance. I think that you said something like that, and what I wanted to add was I think that the fight against communism gave American culture in general an incredible relevance, and that there was. And part of the reason was political. I mean, I think that it was perceived of as a war of ideas, and just to take one example, who knows if Eisenhower or Kennedy or Johnson or any of these guys gave a damn about Willem de Kooning, abstract expressionism. I mean, it probably wasn't what they liked, but they understood, or people around them understood, that this was like an incredible expression of vital American culture and originality and freedom and all sorts of things that were ideologically useful, and so I think that America was I feel during the Cold War less xenophobic, more sincerely interested in things that other people were doing, not always for the best reasons, but and more invested in making an innovative culture, which was not simply about conquering markets and making money, although that's always going to be there, but that the culture itself was perceived to be in competition with this other system.
And this is something I want to build on because I think back to an essay or a few essays I believe you wrote on Andrei Tarkovsky specifically about Stalker and Tarkovsky's or Russia's insistence that such a film as Stalker could never be made under a market system. I don't know whether that's true or not. It's certainly an assertion worth thinking about, but it gets me thinking about the decades when communism existed. Even aside from the realities of communism itself, would you say that the existence of communism sort of gave, how to put it, it gave currency to the idea of multiple envisionable ways forward, multiple envisionable worlds, multiple envisionable ways for humanity to go? I mean, is that something that there was then, and do you think that's gone away?
Well, that's an interesting. That's a very interesting way to look at it. I think that because communism as an ideology is so aggressively future-oriented, that it more or less obliged its ideological adversary, whatever we want to call it, the culture of the West. I mean, it's more than just capitalism. The imperative to think in terms of the future as well. America's always been a kind of optimistic society, or at least traditionally was an optimistic society. I mean, the fact that it's not, it's an absence that is felt very strongly. I mean, it's part of, our current political discourse. I mean, we're somehow sliding backwards and this, that, and the other thing. But I do think that you're onto something when you say that there was a greater willingness to engage the future. I mean, look at the space race.
Yes.
For example, I mean, something which, I don't know that I ever, I sort of took it for granted again as like a kid who grew up, when all this, with all this space paraphernalia, but it just seemed completely pathetic to me to like give this. Oh, we can't afford this anymore. It's just not. We're just not going to do this now. And that if the communists were still somehow in power, that would not be the case.
And this, I mean, there's a whole complicating factor that comes up here. We can think and talk about how the presence of communism may have made the non-communist world less xenophobic, sort of paradoxically may have made them engage more. We can talk about how we watch and enjoy films made under communism, like the Stalkers of the world, and we can talk about how communism maybe stoked the idea that there's some futures ahead of us and there's different ones we can choose from. But when I come down to it, and even when I'm just thinking about American films that were anti-communist during the Cold War, like the ones you write about, and how hokey they can sometimes seem now, and how propagandistic they can seem, there's the reality at the core of this, though, is that I have to come up against the fact that a lot of people suffered under communism ultimately, and I don't quite know how to reconcile that with all I've said and thought before about the sort of stuff the world did when communism existed. That the elephant in the room is the things that were wrong with people's lives when they had to live under communism. Do you know what I'm getting at here?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I think that I mean, that's certainly something that can't be ignored. I mean, you could say, and I wouldn't dispute that there's a sense in which communism as a project it turned out to be an utter disaster for millions of people, and was instrumental in provoking a number of cataclysms. I mean, the Cultural Revolution in China, the Stalin purges, and so on. I would say that that there have been other cataclysms in history, and not every cataclysm, a social cataclysm, was produced by the communists. And one of the things that I think that Americans tend to forget is what how fortunate we are as people. I mean, yes, there was a terrible bloodbath here in the 19th century, the Civil War, but we don't really think of things, as like what do we call, what was the system that destroyed the indigenous people here? I mean, what was the system that had slavery for hundreds of years? I mean, I'm not trying to be self-righteous about this or engage in some kind of moral equivalence, but I'm just saying that that history is a horror show, and communism was part of that. This I would see it as this dream that became a nightmare. But that it's hard for me to feel as smug as an American or as somebody who a product of the West. I mean, we're not even talking about all the dreadful things that happened in Europe over the centuries, or colonialism and all this stuff. You know what I mean? It's that
right.
to see, to feel that it's we avoided this dreadful mistake, and that there wasn't any cost to our own situation.
And given all we've talked about, I want to touch back on the sentiment you referenced at the beginning of our conversation about, the sentiment that went away for a while when the period you cover in An Army of Phantoms began. This idea that if I want to send a message, I'll use Western Union. Art, like cinema, is not for sending messages. Well, that it started being for that for a while in America, and this is an idea as a cinephile myself, I tend to fall back to saying, well, cinema is above sending messages. If you have to send a message with a movie, you might be doing something wrong as a filmmaker, but, it always comes back to haunt me. Well, it seems to be an effective means of conveying things like that. Where do you fall right now as far as the relationship of cinema and the giving of messages?
Okay, that's not hard for me to answer. I mean, I am, I think, fundamentally an aesthete, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I mean, I certainly don't feel that I have to agree with the politics of an artist, or even necessarily the politics of the artwork to appreciate it. Although I would say that in some cases, in the case of, let's say, The Birth of a Nation would be the most obvious one, I can appreciate the genius of this movie and be appalled by it at the same time. And in that case, I can't. I mean, as somebody who teaches film history, I believe that the film, people have to see it and think about it, come to terms with it. It's a great movie. It's also is a significant episode in American social history. But there are things about it that are just horrible and hard to watch, and you feel terrible, kind of. Inflicting that on people. I would say that, Triumph of the Will is a lesser example, but something similar. So, and there are movies that I would concede have ideological things that I don't, that just jump out at me. I was thinking of, for example, the Johnny Moe film Hero, which is sort of his first step into a kind of this historical spectacular. And I mean, it just struck me. I mean, I thought it was a very beautiful movie and extremely well made, but I also thought that it was a movie that partook of a fascist aesthetic, something which I could not help but write about in writing about the movie. But there are plenty of filmmakers whose work I love, who I don't think I would agree with, and in the end, it's a great film is a great film. But I do believe that movies are to a large part, a kind of, I'll use this word in this term in a social medium.
Right.
In that, like lots of masses of people go to see them, many people produce them and are involved in producing them, and that it gives them, it inevitably makes them, gives them a political aspect. I mean, somebody like, to take the purest film artist I can think of is Stan Brackage. And I realize, there are some things that people had ideological objections to his movies, for sure, which a lot of which had to do with him as a person or as a father or a husband, whatever. I can cede all that and still say that this guy is a great artist, and he's making, fantastic films, and, like, stuff that nobody else is doing, and the politics or even the psychology of it is not a tremendous issue for me, although not without interest. But he's like an individual guy,
right,
out there, doing this. I mean, as soon as you're I don't know, Sam Fuller, Cecil B. DeMille. I mean, as soon as you're working with, lots of people making a movie for a large audience, and in some cases engaging in social issues, then the politics becomes part of it, or the political messages. That's where we started.
I've been speaking with Jay Hoberman, senior film critic at The Village Voice, and the author of many books of film criticism and film history, including, most recently, An Army of Phantoms, American Movies in the Making of the Cold War, the prequel, I guess, the first part of a trilogy, of which the second part is The Dream Life on the 60s, the third taking us up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, forthcoming. Jim, thanks so much for taking the time to come on the program today.
It was a great pleasure for me.
This has been the Marketplace of Ideas, and I've been Colin Marshall. You can hear this conversation again or any other in the Marketplace of Ideas history at colinmarshallradio.com or on the iTunes Store. Just search for the Marketplace of Ideas. All the shows there as podcasts, completely free, completely downloadable, completely listenable on your Zune, your iPod, your iRiver, your computer, whatever you want to use it there. The website of Ben Althouse, the man who makes our theme music, is available at benalthouse.com. And if you want weekly updates on all things MOI, sign up for the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. Details at colinmarshallradio.com. Click the Marketplace of Ideas logo. There you'll find them. Simple, easy, subscribable, unsubscribable, whatever you want to do. It's the Marketplace of Ideas mailing list. As always, thank you for tuning in. This has been the Marketplace of Ideas. Catch you next time for cultural conversation of the depth you demand.